Pride/Prejudice, Chapter 3, Segment 2. Mr. Bingley does sometimes give the impression of being flighty or frivolous, Jane was saying, but it is just his natural modesty. He really is quite level-headed. Yes, Elizabeth said, it was obvious that Mr. Darcy's words sprang from a fear of Mr. Bingley's being in love with you. I know Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst would dearly love to see their brother married to Miss Darcy, Jane said. Yet, Elizabeth said, I suspect that the desire arises on their part, as well as on Mr. Darcy's, to create a close tie between the two families, rather than from any concern for their brother's happiness or genuine appreciation of Miss Darcy's merits. Jane frowned. I think there is some truth in what you say. They forget, Elizabeth said, that in such an important matter as a man's choice of wife, their wishes will inevitably carry less weight than his. But Mr. Bingley does speak very highly of his friend's discernment, Jane said. You yourself told me that Mr. Darcy is said to have an impressive library at his home in Derbyshire, and everybody praises his extraordinary learning. I should think the two of you ought to find a great many subjects for conversation. Elizabeth grimaced. I doubt very much whether Mr. Darcy's library contains any novels, and he would deem anything written by a female not worth the cost of the rags that make up the paper. Oh, Lizzie, Jane said, all I know is that Mr. Bingley values his friend's advice and that Miss Bingley shares her brother's opinion. And wishes herself in his place, Elizabeth said. I will pretend not to understand that, Jane said. You cannot misunderstand this next item, Elizabeth said. You would have laughed out loud watching Mr. Darcy trying to compose a letter to his sister, accosted at every line by Miss Bingley. She deluged him with interruptions, from compliments on his penmanship to requests to be remembered to Miss Darcy, and he rebuffed each intrusion with serene detachment. It may simply be courtesy, Jane said. A courteous gentleman, Elizabeth said, would not allow Miss Bingley to deceive herself by fancying that her regard is reciprocated. Watching Miss Bingley's attack on all sides, deflected by Mr. Darcy's unconcealed and unchecked derision, I could only wonder, how can Miss Bingley, a resident of this household, be totally unaware of what I have so easily discovered after only 3 days? Or does the poor woman hope that by constant bombardment she can force a breach in an impenetrable wall? She must see that every cannonball flies wide of the target, and that the defender is hard at work reinforcing the already impressive fortifications. You have changed your metaphor, Jane said. You began with a trial at law, and have now turned instead to a siege. It seems more fitting, Elizabeth said. Besides, Jane said, it merely demonstrates that Mr. Darcy feels no partiality for Miss Bingley, not that he harbors an inappropriate fondness for her brother. True, Elizabeth said, but now we come to the crux of my argument. You know how I like to attempt to draw a person's character. I had only started when Mr. Bingley, in a fit of exaggerated humility, claimed to be not worth the effort, calling himself shallow and direct, and chose as his example the idea that if he took it into his head to quit Netherfield, he would be gone at a moment's notice. Mr. Darcy, just like the clever husband with the simple wife, sneered at such an uncomplicated nature. He insisted that rather than sticking to his resolve, Mr. Bingley would give in at once if a friend asked him to. Mr. Darcy is so fond of Mr. Bingley, yet he seemed to think the less of him for his willingness to accommodate his own wishes. Elizabeth shook her head at such incomprehensible behavior. But what is the great significance of this exchange? Jane asked. I don't see it. I haven't related the whole yet, Elizabeth said. I thought your Mr. Bingley deserved some support. He can't stand up to Mr. Darcy's badinage. I'm sure he can do very well without your help, Jane said with uncharacteristic sharpness. Well, no, I don't think he can, Elizabeth said, not at all displeased at her sister's defense of her suitor. But in this instance, I'm afraid I did more harm than good. All you have done is prove Mr. Bingley's amiability, I said. Far better than his own modesty will allow. that he would readily change his plans because his friend asked him to, and require no other explanation, is but testimony of affection. You see, they weren't really arguing over whether Mr. Bingley would leave Hertfordshire or stay at Netherfield, but over something much more momentous. "What do you mean?" Jane asked. "Marriage. Mr. Bingley's to you, to be precise." "Oh, that's absurd. Besides, I would never want my happiness to come at the expense of someone else's," Jane said with a sigh. "That's nonsense," Elizabeth said. "You can't mean it." "Think, Lizzie. What chance of contentment could we have in our marriage if by choosing me, Mr. Bingley lost the friendship of Mr. Darcy?" "What kind of friend is Mr. Darcy if he ends a friendship because his friend marries?" Elizabeth asked. "Besides, I don't think it's you he objects to, so much as the idea of his friends marrying at all. What could he possibly find objectionable in you?" "What else did he say exactly?" Jane asked. "It wasn't what he said, but the expression on his face," Elizabeth said, pausing to recall. "After I spoke my little piece, Mr. Bingley declared that if Mr. Darcy were not such a great tall fellow in comparison with myself, I should not pay him half as much deference." Mr. Darcy looked angry enough to spit. "Oh, that's dreadful," Jane said. "Not as bad as all that," Elizabeth said. "Whatever else one may say against him, Mr. Darcy's manners are too elegant to allow him to spit in the presence of ladies." "I wish you would be serious," Jane remonstrated, as so often. "I am perfectly serious, but I haven't finished the account. If that were all, no harm done. If Mr. Darcy is angry with me, I don't care that for it." Elizabeth snapped her fingers. "But I did care that by attempting to help Mr. Bingley, I caused a quarrel between him and his redoubtable friend." "Whatever have you done now?" Jane asked. "Only encouraged Mr. Bingley to stand up for himself, which Mr. Darcy took as insolence. Mr. Bingley was emboldened to speak freely, much in the manner of a schoolboy taunting his tutor in front of company, saying that nothing was so frightening as Mr. Darcy on a Sunday afternoon when he had nothing to do. Then I felt sorry and wished I had not spoken, for Mr. Darcy turned a rather unhealthy shade of white, and glowered at his friend until I was convinced that poor Mr. Bingley will pay for it later." "They will make it up," Jane said. "You mustn't tease yourself over a silly remark. But it is a lesson all the same. You do have a tendency to say whatever pops into your head." "Unfair," Elizabeth said, "after I study so hard to find a bon mot, something clever and original, and to make it seem as if I had just thought of it that minute. You of all people should know I resemble our sister Mary in that regard, not Kitty or Lydia, who truly utter whatever words happen to be on their tongue at the moment of opening their mouth." Jane laughed. "Now you are expecting me to cry foul, and to tell you how far superior in wit you are to all our sisters, but I will simply let it stand, Lizzie." "You have found me out at last," Elizabeth said. "The truth is, I was carried away by the pleasures of a real contest. I've never encountered such an opponent as this Mr. Darcy. Every other man just crumbles at the first show of spirit, as if with all his education and knowledge of the world he can't put two sensible words together when addressing one paltry female." "Not so paltry," Jane said. "But be careful, Lizzie. You will go too far." "It's true," Elizabeth said. "Mr. Darcy brings out the worst in me. I want to burst his bubble of pride, put a crack in that solid wall of his contempt, just as badly as Miss Bingley, although for different motives." She couldn't help laughing, even now, at the memory. It had been startling, frightening, but somehow exhilarating. Every time she had guessed correctly and provoked a reaction in that tall, fair iceberg. "All I ask," Jane said, "is that you not come between Mr. Darcy and his friend." "That I can safely promise," Elizabeth said with a smile. "It's you who is doing that."